And I appreciate, I know you do too, Marianne Neely, Catherine Braun, and a number of others who collaborate to make this opportunity possible. We appreciate them and those who fund this occasion as well. Last night's full moon, with the lunar eclipse accompanied by the streaking comet, would have been a perfect occasion for the preaching of Lorenzo Dow. For several months, I have carried Lorenzo Dow around in my head. I had hoped by this presentation to be able to channel Crazy Dow. He was really a remarkable man and may very well have been the most colorful character to visit the Mississippi Territory. However, I was able to experience a mystical moment last October with Jerry, my wife, when she and I were visiting in Charlottesville. Knowing that the Reverend Lorenzo Dow was buried only 2 hours away in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., we made the trip. And we located the grave. The grave is located on a postcard-like picture of a cemetery, the Oak Hills Cemetery. And when I was able to locate this burial slab, I read a passage from Peggy Dow's writings of the vicissitudes. She tells about her trip traveling northeastwardly up the federal road and making access into current-day Pentlala, where Manak's Tavern was located. The federal road had been recently constructed and was soon to be completed. This was November 1811. And if you would indulge me, I'd like to read just a simple paragraph from Peggy Dow's words about an encounter she had on the whole federal road just south of Pentlala, or Manak's Tavern. She writes, "We came across a family who were moving to the Mississippi. They had a number of small children, and although they had something to cover them like a tent, yet they suffered considerably from the rain the night before. And to add to that, the woman told me they had left an aging father at a man's house by the name of Manak 1 or 2 days before, and that she expected he was dead by that time. They were as black as almost the natives, and the woman seemed very much disturbed at their situation. I felt pity for her. I thought her burthen was really heavier than mine. We kept on, and about middle of the day, the house where the poor man had been left with his wife and son and daughter, we located. A few hours before we got there, he had closed his eyes in death. They had laid him out and expected to bury him that evening, but they could not get anything to make a coffin of, only split stuff to make a kind of box, and so put him in the ground." In the United States, the Second Great Awakening became the religious and the social context which catapulted Lorenzo Dow to prominence. The Protestant religious movement began in the 1790s, and by the first 2 decades of the 19th century, membership in Protestant churches, especially Methodist and Baptist churches, had grown to record highs. The Second Great Awakening probably peaked out around 1850. So in these few minutes entrusted to me, I wish to guide us through an overview of Lorenzo Dow's life and work. If you have some acquaintance with Dow's legacy, you must know that this circuit-riding Methodist, and I use Methodist in quotes, is often remembered by his eccentricities. He was certainly weird in some ways, and his craziness drew phenomenally large crowds during his lifetime. However, I am putting forth the premise that Dow's eccentricities should not eclipse the substance of his life and work. An examination of these connections and convictions will demonstrate that Lorenzo Dow was a harbinger for change in the political and social context of early America. Lorenzo Dow was called Crazy Dow. It was a moniker he accepted and exploited to his advantage when promoting his preaching engagements. He referred to himself as a cosmopolite. And the word cosmopolite comes from the Greek, and it means citizen of the world. Indeed, his preaching was worldwide. If one focuses on the weirdness of Dow, much that is substantive will be missed. It is said that he preached to more people in his era than any other minister. He made 3 visits to England and Ireland in 1799, 1805, and 1818. These transatlantic crossings were challenging enough, but Dow was a man of great endurance and determination. He was born and raised in Tolan County, Connecticut. His religious experience as a young teenager was extensively introspective, characterized with fear and anxiety. He had fear and anxiety about his own personal future, and he tried to define the future in religious terms. Lorenzo Dow always attributed his call and conversion to a man named Reverend Hope Hull. Hope Hull was a circuit-riding Methodist who was in good standing with the Methodist Conference. He would become known as the Father of Methodism in the state of Georgia, would become a founder of the University of Georgia. The Reverend Hope Hull never made it to Alabama, not even the territory of Alabama, but that's a backstory for another day. In 1796, Dow's application to the Connecticut Conference was denied by the voting Methodists who always related to him at some distance. Contrary to the advice of his parents, he accepted the tentative affirmation of the conference as a circuit rider in 1798. Just think about that. Lorenzo Dow, at 21 years of age, was now a circuit rider on probation. How long the line must have been, I don't know. At first, he was assigned to the Cambridge Circuit in New York and then on to Massachusetts and Vermont. And I wish time permitted some examination of Dow's ministry in New England and in Canada. He was born to Humphrey and Tabitha Dow, October the 16th, 1777, in Coventry, Connecticut. And when he was 14 years of age, he considered suicide as a means of putting to rest the demon inside of him. His religious beliefs roughly followed Methodist teachings of John Wesley. And by the way, he had visions of John Wesley. Against the church's directive, in 1799, Lorenzo set sail for England, where he perfected his fire and brimstone style of preaching and traveled to Ireland as well. He went to England for the purposes of initiating, and this is a little controversial. It's hard to know whether Lorenzo Dow initiated the camp meetings or not, but he certainly popularized them, and he did that in England. He went to Ireland to preach against Roman Catholicism. So he adopted the camp meeting method of preaching, these outdoor encampments that lasted for sometimes most of a week. Lorenzo Dow was personally unkempt. He did not practice personal hygiene, and his long hair and beard were described as never having met a comb. Makes me envious. He usually owned one set of clothes, those that were on his back, and when those clothes became so badly worn and full of holes that they were no longer capable of covering him, some person in the audience usually would donate a replacement. To be sure, he was an orator. He preferred words to weapons. He was too unique for the Methodist. That group disavowed his connection, but he kept a steady course. He was a man without a church. And I think Dow reached the point that getting church sanction was immaterial to him and almost an irrelevancy, because now he was free to ride a circuit of his choosing. And that indeed he did. He didn't have to make reports to the church conference. He was all over the map and free to do so as an independent Methodist. It's been stated that during the first 8 months of his circuit riding absence from home, before leaving on his first European trip, he traveled over 4,000 miles and covered over 200,000 miles during his entire career. One person has summarized Dow's circuit riding like this. Scarcely a neighborhood from Canada to Georgia or from the Atlantic to the Mississippi that has not some tradition to relate or some tale to tell of the visit and the preaching of Lorenzo Dow, and there is scarcely an individual in all New England that has not heard their fathers or mothers, their grandfathers or grandmothers relate some one or more of the witty sayings or speak the humorous doings of this singular man. I want to share with you an interesting quotation, a witty quotation from Lorenzo Dow. You might not have known its origin, but I think you've heard part of it before. Lorenzo Dow, and by the way, the context for this was he was preaching against Calvinism. He says, you can't and you can't. You shall and you shan't. You will and you won't. And you'll be damned if you do and damned if you don't. Now, the next time you say that, would you think Lorenzo Dow? Some contend that he was the first Protestant preacher to enter what became Alabama and Mississippi. He spread the word in all the then 17 states. It was common for him to assemble crowds of 2,000 or 3,000 people, and when he lived briefly in Albemarle County, Virginia, he spoke one time to a crowd of 10,000 people in a camp meeting style environment. I'm just wondering, how do you propel your voice with that clarity and at that distance to 10,000 people who are gathered in the out of doors? I don't know how that is done. But I might practice sometimes. Now, Lorenzo Dow married twice. The first time he was married to Peggy Dow, married on September the 4th, 1804. They had a daughter, Letitia, who was born in 1806 in Ireland, and she died in Warrington, Ireland, and I assume is buried there. His second marriage, well, let me tell you about his second marriage. After he had been a grieving widower for some time, he stood up to preach one day to his congregation in his home state of Connecticut, and I'm loosely paraphrasing what he said, but it's an accurate, loose paraphrase. He said, I'm here today to admit that I've lived long enough as a widower, and I'm ready to get married again. And God has put it on my heart to know this, that somewhere in this congregation, there is a woman who is eligible to marry me. And if you feel the divine imprint upon your heart as to marriage eligibility to me, I want you to please stand. Two women stood up. One in the back and one in the front. And I don't know how Lorenzo weaseled his way out of that, but he simply said, I think this person here on the front row was the first to rise. I'll take you. And he married Lucy Daubert in 1820. That's quite a selection process. Now, I'm going to talk with you about his preaching and camp meetings and their revival environment. Greg Wazelkoff is accurate in saying that these camp meetings often found participants regaled with emotional, spellbinding oratory suffused with cries of mercy and extemporaneous exhortations to accept the gospel and repent of sins. Theater, good theater, was built into camp meetings. Rare displays of religious devotion. You could see public displays of piety in these sparsely settled frontier areas. And of course, revivals naturally drew large crowds. Itinerant preachers like Lorenzo Dow, his wife Peggy, who had passed through the Tombigbee and Tensas settlements several times between 1801 and 1811. These itinerant preachers, according to Wazelkoff, and I think he's right, made very slow headway, slow progress in gaining converts until December 1811. It was in the end of December 1811, moving into January of 1812, that the new Madrid earthquakes were an intense experience for residents along that fault line. And I don't know how we determine this today with our technology looking back 200 years, but I have read that the new Madrid quake, the quake itself, registered a 7.5 to 7.9 on the Richter. And the aftershock the next day was a 7.4. They remain, I'm told, the most powerful earthquakes to hit the contiguous United States east of the Rocky Mountains and in recorded history. The truth is, once those quakes occurred, people got converted. White Americans and enslaved Africans alike interpreted those tremors to be admonitions from the Almighty to seek salvation, and maybe the last such warnings they would ever receive. So thousands responded in conversion experiences, and Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian church rolls were inflated quickly. Membership in the Methodist Church alone jumped from 789 to 1,307 in a single year. Let's talk just a moment about camp meetings. As you can imagine, they were well attended, especially when speakers as popular as Lorenzo Dow appeared. They resulted in high emotions. Once a speaker had finished, another would often rise to take his place. Several ministers, sometimes from different denominations, provided virtually non-stop preaching. Can you imagine that? Non-stop preaching. Even I could not tolerate the view. And of course, there was an abundance of singing during the day and in the evening, and late into the night, attenders anticipated and had emotional conversion experiences with crying and with trances. Lee Sandlin says this: a typical meeting began in a low-key, almost solemn way. A preacher gave a sermon of welcome and led in a prayer of peace and community. This was followed by the singing of several hymns, and then there would be more sermons. The next day and the day following, the sermons grew increasingly sensational and impassioned, and the excited response of the crowd grew more prolonged. By the second or third day, people were crying out during the sermons and shouting prayers and bursting into loud lamentations. They began grabbing at their neighbors and desperately pleading with them to repent. They sobbed uncontrollably and ran in terror through the crowd, shoving aside everybody in their path. As the preachers ranted without let-up, the crowd was driven into a kind of collective ecstasy. In the night, as the torches and bonfires flared around the meeting ground and the darkness of the trackless forest closed in, people behaved as if possessed by something new and unfathomable. Finley wrote, "A strange supernatural power seemed to pervade the entire mass of mind there collected." So Lorenzo Dow was very much a part of popularizing the camp meeting. He also liked to appear unexpectedly at public events. He would announce in a loud voice that exactly 1 year from today, he would preach on this spot. He never disappointed his audiences. He always appeared exactly 365 days later at the appointed place, usually met by large crowds. He shouted, he screamed, he cried, he begged, he flattered, he insulted, he challenged people in their beliefs. He told stories and made jokes. I don't know whether I'm on track with this or not. Probably not. There was a phenomenon arising around these camp meetings related to the jerks. These were people who were overcome emotionally, physiologically by the power of the gospel message, and they jerked themselves almost to death. They fell on each other. They created quite a frenzy. Someone has said about the jerks, and let me describe what's happening here with this quote. When the head alone was affected, and forgive my attribution, but I think this comes from Barton Stone. When the head alone was affected, it would be jerked backward and forward or from side to side so quickly that the features of the face could not be distinguished. when the whole system was affected. I have seen the person stand in one place and jerk backward and forward in quick succession, their head nearly touching the floor behind and before. And when people recovered from the jerks, they could not account for what happened to them. But some have told me, says Stone, that those were among the happiest seasons of their lives. I just want you to get some sense of these camp meetings. There's another phenomenon that was employed by Lorenzo Dow. Before he would preach a sermon on the Last Judgment, he was reputed to have sent a boy up a tree with a trumpet in order to have him blow on the instrument at just the right moment. And if you look at this drawing of a camp meeting, if you can detect a little bit here to your left, behind the preaching stand, do you see the boy with the bugle? He's ready to play that bugle at the right cue. At other times, the heralded sign of the bugle created mass hysteria at camp meetings, and sometimes without Dow's engineering. During one revival on Long Island, when a trumpet happened to sound from a passing slough, it combined with the rumble of an approaching storm. And Dow said, the most awful representation of the day of judgment of anything I ever beheld. Well, we got to move on into the Mississippi Territory and talk about the curse. Usually, Lorenzo Dow was well received, but there were some exceptions. Dow's sermons were very unpopular in the Deep South. And I think it's because he was a fierce abolitionist. He frequently was threatened with personal violence. He sometimes was forcibly ejected from towns, pelted with stones, eggs, and rotten vegetables. Lorenzo Dow is known to have preached the destruction and complete ruin of St. Stephen's, Alabama. It points to the fulfillment of his prophecy that in the next 100 years, no stone would lie on the other one there. And we are told by James S. Graham in his History of Clark County that having stated that the itinerant preacher, when he was to leave old St. Stephen's, did so only after he prayed God to send a curse upon that place. Later, Dow predicted that the town would become the roosting place for bats and for owls. Now, it's my understanding that while there is a laudable effort ongoing to restore and recover some of the historical rudiments of the town, and I hope that is accomplished and maybe can reverse the curse, one still has to know how to get there. Now, I want to just kind of morph a little to tell you why I think Lorenzo Dow is a person of substance. In spite of his cute antics, he does take a position that's very unpopular at times. He railed against the moral evils of slavery. And it could very well be that Dow was outright rejected by the townspeople of Old St. Stephen's because he took an abolitionist stand related to slavery. He was fierce and forceful in doing so. Benjamin Brawley, who wrote in the Journal of Negro History, published in 1916, quotes Lorenzo Dow. Dow says slavery in the South is an evil that calls for national reform and repentance. As all men are created equal and independent by God of nature, slavery must have moral evil for its foundation, seeing it violates the law of nature as established by its author. Now, slaves had first been brought into the region during the colonial period. But it was during the territorial period that their population grew in significant numbers. Between 1798 and 1817, the number of slaves in the Mississippi Territory increased from approximately 4,000 to 70,000. It was in keeping with Dow's fearlessness to denounce the effects of discrimination against Negroes in early churches that sometimes he was not allowed to preach in churches. Brawley goes on to tell us about the time when he even questioned the authority of Francis Asbury as being jealous of the rising power of Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Church. And he also, Brawley that is, tells us that a radical preacher of the gospel could not be moved with compassion on observing the condition of the Negroes in the South during these years, when denied admission to white churches when he approached Savannah. He was accosted by a Negro who, seeing that he had no place to stop, inquired as to whether he would accept hospitality in a black home. He embraced the opportunity and found the people by whom he was entertained as decent as 2/3 of the citizens of Savannah. When on another occasion in Savannah, he learned that Andrew Bryan, the Negro minister of the city, had, because of his preaching, been whipped unmercifully and imprisoned, Dow preached to the congregation himself. He moved among Negroes and preached to the congregation and lived with Negroes socially because no one else would offer him a place. He counted them with pride among his converts, treasured in his memory his experiences among them. So do you still think that he's a man of eccentricities only? I want to move now in almost diametrically to the month of March 1805. Albemarle County in Virginia was the epicenter of camp meetings. And as I mentioned earlier, Lorenzo Dow had preached to a crowd of 10,000 persons. Henry Dearborn, who was the Secretary of War under Thomas Jefferson, sent this letter to the president. Sir, the celebrated preacher Dow, who has returned from a long tour southward and westward, and which extended into lower Louisiana, was requested to deliver the articles accompanying this to you. He gave them to me this morning and desired me to send them to you. Henry Dearborn, Secretary of War. So Dow was not unknown in the Piedmont of Virginia, especially in 1805. He then went to Washington, D.C., where he was invited to preach in Congress Hall before the House. Also, he apparently met with President Jefferson. In the Jefferson Papers is a letter from Henry Fry, Reverend Henry Fry, dated February 26, 1805, in which Fry says that Lorenzo Dow was the bearer of the letter. Fry told Jefferson that Dow had a desire to visit Europe and to preach there as he did in America. And therefore he was requesting Jefferson to make a personal interrogation of Dow and give him advice and direction of what may be needful. Shortly thereafter, in November of 1805, Dow set sail for England, having received official, and I'm quoting, official American protection under the seal of the United States from Secretary of State, Mr. Madison. It wasn't unusual for Dow to transport letters of significance between political persons who held office. Although Dow kept moving from place to place, in 1812 and 1813 he lived temporarily in Buckingham County, and of course that was adjacent to Albemarle. He wrote a political pamphlet in support of Jefferson, Madison, and Republican principles. And Republican is with a small r, please. I want to call to your attention that Dow was also the proud owner of patent medicine. This little snippet comes from the New Bedford Mercury newspaper in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the date is 1827. It's about Lorenzo Dow. Listen carefully. Lorenzo Dow arrived at Tuscumbie, Alabama on the 20th ultimo, and lost no time in giving notice that he would preach the following day, that he had certain religious tracts for sale and also an extensive stock of Dow's family medicine. In the 1850s, there was a note looking in retrospect on Dow's visit to Richmond, Indiana, or what became Richmond, Indiana. You can see the guy's all over the map, and he has name recognition. In this 1857 piece in the business directory of Richmond, Indiana, we are told that Lorenzo's travel expenses were paid in part by the sale of family medicine, as he termed it. This was a restorative, a purgative, if you please. And we're told in this piece that the medicine consisted of Epsom salts dissolved in water with the addition of nitric acid. Now, it goes on to say it was recommended as valuable in bilious derangements. And this was a patented medicine. For an extra fee, I have samples in the lobby. I'm just kidding. I could never compete with John Hall and his black drink. In Lorenzo Dow's will, which was executed, but not implemented until he died, of course, executed in 1825, we read these words. I direct in the first place that all my just debts and personal charges be duly paid and discharged, and all the residue of my estate, both real and personal, of every nature and kind, I give and bequeath unto my beloved wife, Lucy Dow, to be at her disposal as she may think fit, including my patent family medicine. Now, I wish I had time to build the case that Lorenzo Dow also had an elevated view of women in his day. I don't have time, but it's interesting to study and to read. Let me just conclude by saying, giving some emphasis to the fact that in the subsequent generation to Lorenzo Dow, and even the generation after that, thousands of fathers named their sons after him. I don't think you'd want to hang a nickname like Dow, Crazy Dow, or Lorenzo Dow on your son for life if he were just a person of eccentricities. Thousands of children. Did you know that the brother of Brigham Young was named Lorenzo Dow Young? Did you know that the uncle to Wyatt Earp was named Lorenzo Dow Earp? Google Lorenzo Dow and see how many other names pop up. I just want to tell you that he died in Georgetown in 1834 after an illness and being cared for by his friend George Haller. He had asked before passing away to use his old great coat as his winding sheet. He was placed to rest in the Holmead burying ground. The Holmead Cemetery soon fell into disrepair. It had been neglected for decades, and then in the 1880s, William Wilson Corcoran, the great philanthropist, gave his personal money to have Lorenzo Dow exhumed and reinterred in the Oak Hill Cemetery near Georgetown. His epitaph read, "A Christian is the highest style of man. He is a slave to no sect, takes no private road, but looks through nature up to nature's God." Well, I think we owe a moral debt. And I wish I could tell you that when I read from the writings of Peggy Dow at the gravesite of Lorenzo in the Oak Hill Cemetery that my reading was concluded with signs and portents. That was not true. We simply made our way quietly out of the cemetery, but I felt like I had discharged a moral debt to the great Lorenzo Dow. I would just simply say that if you're going to church tomorrow, would you take a jerk with you and see what happens? Thank you very much.